Okay, let's get going. Hi, I'm Joanne Donsky, a member of Beth Am's Jewish and Israel Advocacy Committee, also known as Beth Am JIAC. Welcome to the fourth class in our 5-part crash course on the history of Israel. Like all of our sessions, today's class will last an hour and a half, including Q&A. Any slides used in the lecture will be shared with you at the end of the 5-class series. Within a few days after class, you will receive a recording of this session in case you'd like to review it. I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of our program, Beth Am JIAC of Los Altos Hills and the Contra Costa JCC. This course is happening thanks to their time, effort, planning, and financial generosity. I'd also like to thank the following partners for their financial support: Congregation Kolemet of Palo Alto, Congregation Beth David of Saratoga, and the Sonoma County Israel Committee. And thanks to all of you for making the time to be with us for this crash course. We offer courses like this, We offer courses like this to you free, but if you've been enjoying this class and would like to support future programs like these, please consider an optional donation, which can be given online. The link is being entered into the chat now, so you can open the chat and click on the link and go to a donation page where you can complete your donation easily later. Beth Am JIAC and Contra Costa JCC appreciate your generosity. Today's class will again feature Charlotte Korchak teaching live. It's great that she can take the time from her busy schedule, she's in Great Britain this week, to join us via Zoom. During her talk, you can send questions to Charlotte, getting clarification in real time on topics she's discussing. She'll be checking the chat. You can also ask more general questions during the Q&A at the end. Please remember that all questions should be typed into the chat, not by raising your hand or your virtual hand. Please make your questions concise, relevant to what's being taught, and ask in the form of a question, not a speech. If your question is about the content, which most questions will be, please direct them to Charlotte. All you need to do is click on the chat icon, look at the bottom of the chat screen, and click on the down arrow in the blue bar, highlight Charlotte Korchak's name, and it will be near the top, and enter your question. If you have a question about any course logistics or tech issues, feel free to direct those questions to me. That's it for logistics. Now please join me in welcoming our amazing teacher, Charlotte Korchak.
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great morning. I'm having a good evening. Like was said, I am currently in Manchester in the UK. So I'm just bouncing around the world while I'm doing this for y'all, which is really exciting. Next week, I will finally be home in Jerusalem. But for now, let's kick this off and start our last class of the history, which is going to be on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So just a quick recap. Last week, we went from 1948 until today, where we focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict, really Israel's conflict with the Arab countries around Israel, the Arab world. Now, of course, Palestinians are also Arabs, but really starting in 1948 onwards, and one could even argue a little bit before, we really start to see a unique character that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will take on and will continue to develop its own unique character from 1948-49 until today. And so we're going to be jumping back to 1948, and we're going to look at that history yet again, but through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So with that, let's dive in. I do want to just give, I know Joanne said we'll take questions, but I do just want to give a quick warning. This class tends to take me a little longer than an hour, so I will do my best to take as many questions as we have, but our amazing hosts were smart enough to know that this was going to be this way, and they booked 5 sessions for that purpose. So next week, we will be able to take any questions that I was not able to get to in the last 4 sessions. If you have a question and it will not be answered or won't get answered, please write it down and we can take it next week as well. I just don't want anyone to be disappointed with the very short Q&A time that we will have today. It's just a lot of content, and I don't want to sell y'all short on this very, very important session. So with that, let's dive in. So let's start by answering what I would argue to be one of the more important questions, which is, what is a Palestinian, right? I mean, this is a term that's used, and there are Jews who even say, well, the Jews were Palestinians. So what's a Palestinian? Weren't they just Arabs? And so it's really incredibly important to understand the conflict today, to understand this evolution of this identity. And I think that's really a first point to note, which is identities evolve. Right? 250 years ago, there was no such thing as an American. And then we declared independence. And all of a sudden, now there was an American national identity. And the same kind of thing happened with the Palestinians, just without the independence part. So let's try to understand this evolution. So if we go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, we have a reality where in the Middle East, there are Arab tribes who live under empires, right? And so their identities were very much local, and they were based predominantly on their tribe and on their religion, right? So somebody might refer to themselves as a Husseini, which would be their tribe, and a Muslim. I'm a Husseini Muslim, or I'm a Halabi Druze. And then comes Arab nationalism, which we spoke about 2 classes ago, right? This rise of Arab nationalism in the late 19th, early 20th century. And really, this is when Arabic-speaking people, which is essentially what an Arab was. It was tribes who spoke Arabic. Arabic-speaking people started to identify as Arabs, which was, again, a new idea. And so now, and that didn't negate their old identities. Now they would be a Husseini Muslim Arab with pride, right? That's the idea of a big part of nationalism, is that pride. And so they took on this additional identity of Arab. Now, as the 20th century goes on, the vision of Arab nationalism as this large Arab nation kind of starts to break down into these countries. And what evolves are now national identities to go along with that Arab identity and the religious and the tribal. So now I might be a Husseini Muslim Arab, Jordanian, or Iraqi, or Syrian. But here was the challenge. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, when these Arab tribes started to identify with these national identities, the Arabs in Palestine, in the British Mandate of Palestine, didn't take on that national identity of Palestinian. And the reason is pretty simple. The Jews were calling themselves Palestinians, right? The Jews who were living in the British Mandate of Palestine were calling themselves Palestinian Jews. And so the Arabs didn't adopt that idea. They just kept saying, we are Arabs. We can even point this out when you look at 1937. One of the Islamic leaders within that territory, Haj Amin al-Husseini, he names a government for himself, and he calls it the Arab Higher Committee. He doesn't use the term Palestine in reference to it. He was an Arab nationalist. And so he maintained the moniker of Arab, but didn't adopt that idea of Palestinian. And again, what I love about history is it usually makes sense. So why does this make sense? Because the Jews had come from predominantly Europe. And so the Jews understood what it meant to be a French Jew or a German Jew or a Russian Jew. And so now they were Palestinian Jews. So throughout that time period, the Jews were Palestinians. The Arabs of Palestine were just that, the Arabs of Palestine. And they were still just tribes who identified tribally, religiously, and as Arabs. But then comes 1948. And in 1948, of course, we have the War of Independence, and Israel emerges. And with that comes Israelis. And so Palestinian Jews now no longer are referring to themselves as Palestinians. They are now Israelis, Israeli citizens. And this is when we will slowly start to see that term Palestinian now be applied to the Arabs of Palestine. And we're really going to start to see it in the 50s and into the 60s, when we see the formation of specifically Palestinian, not Arab broader organizations, but Palestinian organizations like Fatah in 1959 or the PLO in 1964. And we'll talk more about that as we go through. So by the time we get to the 1960s and moving forward, we now have the Arabs of Palestine, some still living between the river and the sea, right? In refugee camps in the West Bank, in Gaza, some even in Israel proper, and those who live in refugee camps calling themselves Palestinians. By today, that national identity is solid. They are Palestinians, and to argue that they're not, I think it's an ignorance of history, right? It's kind of like 70 years after the United States was founded saying they're not really Americans, they're all still just a bunch of British colonists. It's like, no, things change. And by now, things have changed. So with that, let's now understand the unique character of this specific group, this national identity. And it's going to take me back to the War of Independence. So if you remember last class, I talked very briefly about a plan that was initiated by David Ben-Gurion, which was called Plan Dalet, or Plan D, as we would say in English. And Plan D essentially was Ben-Gurion saying that we needed to go village to village, and we needed to clear out hostility from within these villages. And our soldiers start to go village to village, specifically along the road to Jerusalem, because that is where Jerusalem was under siege. And they're going village to village, and pretty much everywhere they go, they encounter hostility. Last time we talked about a city, Abu Ghosh, where they didn't encounter hostility. And of course, Abu Ghosh is still there until today. And then they continued on their way. And again, most places they came to, they encountered hostility. And I mentioned one place, and I told you that I would pick up there when we started today. And that place was Deir Yassin, Deiryasin. Deir Yassin being a village, a Palestinian village. And again, that's my terminology for you, an Arab village of the Arabs of Palestine, right on the edge of Jerusalem. If anyone's been to Jerusalem and you know the area of Givat Shaul Har Nof, right on the edge, the western edge of Jerusalem, that is where Deir Yassin was. And essentially, this village had been firing from that territory into Jerusalem, right? There's a little valley in between it. And over the valley, there's a neighborhood of Jerusalem, what was then and what is still today called Bet HaKerem. I know this, I used to live actually in Bet HaKerem, right near this where this whole story took place. And so there was shelling going on from this area into Jerusalem, where the Jews were living in Jerusalem. And so eventually, as they worked their way up the hills to Jerusalem, they make their way into Deir Yassin. Now, who's they? Let's remember that there are 4 militias at this point, right? And again, this was covered 2 classes ago. The Haganah, which is the main fighting force. It's about 30,000 strong at this point. You have its special forces unit, which is the Palmach. All right. And then you have the 2 smaller factions, which are, and when I say smaller, I mean significantly smaller. And of course, we're talking about the Etzel, or in English, what was dubbed as the Irgun, and the Lehi. Now, the Irgun and Lehi together were a few thousand. And what we have to remember about them is that they weren't part of the major fighting force, and they weren't as trained as the major fighting force, i.e. the Haganah. And so when they fought, tended to be a little bit more chaotic, but we needed all fighters to fight. I mean, many of us probably know that there were literally Holocaust survivors getting off boats and being given guns and being like sent up hills to go fight. We needed fighters. So village to village on the road to Jerusalem, and the Etzel and the Lehi are ordered in to Deir Yassin. Now here's the story, and it's an important story because this becomes really a core feature of the Palestinian narrative. Deir Yassin for the Palestinians is described as a massacre. For a lot of historians, it's described as a massacre. For Israelis, it was described as a battle and nothing really more than that. And for some Israelis, they would say it might have been a battle, but it devolved into chaos that led to innocent people dying when they didn't need to die. So what's the story? The Lehi and the Irgun are going to be going into Deir Yassin. A truck with loudspeakers is sent into the city before them to alert the people. The soldiers are coming, get out of the way. If you are an innocent person, get out of the way. By the way, if this sounds familiar, it should. Israel still does this in the Gaza Strip. When Israel goes into Gaza during operations, they drop leaflets and they tell people, get out of the way. Same idea. Now here's the problem. That truck fell into a ditch and it never made its way into Deir Yassin. And so the soldiers of the Lehi and the Irgun going in expected that the town would have been told and that innocent people would have left. Now, that being said, when they did come in, they did actually see, according to their testimony, they saw people fleeing the town down the hillside. And so they went in with this understanding that the vast majority of the people who remained in the town were fighters. And they engaged in a fierce battle with Arab irregulars, Arab fighters, like we spoke about last time. And a battle ensues. Now, here's where things start to get shaky in terms of testimonies. You have Irgun and Lehi fighters who came out saying, it turned into chaos. We didn't know who was innocent and who was not, because we ended up seeing Arab fighters dressed like women. And so we didn't know if somebody who was dressed like a woman was actually a woman or if it was a fighter. And we went into homes and they were booby trapped. And so it became this chaotic environment of throwing grenades into homes, believing that they were fighters and that they were booby trapped, when really there might have been families inside of these homes. And essentially, this very legitimate battle, and again, I don't know how you can frame it any other way, considering that from that territory, they were shelling Jerusalem. This very legitimate battle devolved into chaos. Now, the Palestinians go as far as saying that this, again, turned into an all-out massacre, that these soldiers came in and just slaughtered people in the town. There are Israeli scholars, most recently a new book came out called The Massacre That Never Was by a man named Eliezer Tauber, who claims that actually when looking at all the testimony, this wasn't a massacre at all. It was a battle that again devolved and got chaotic and innocent people died, but to describe it as a massacre would be wrong. And then you have people like Israeli historian Benny Morris, who would describe it as a massacre, again, acknowledging that it was a battle in a war, but it devolved into a massacre. Innocent people were just killed. And even Benny Morris, I will tell you, actually went to an extreme and said it was a massacre. They were taking people out to ditches and killing them. And then he actually walked himself back saying, you know, I looked at more information and I'm not sure that that's exactly how it played out. And then you have the reports from the Arabs to their own people. And this is where Deir Yassin gets interesting. I mean, it's tragic. It's not interesting, but the Arab media played a big role, right, in this moment, where after these battles would take place, they would report on them. And they admitted after the fact of Deir Yassin that they exaggerated the reports coming out of Deir Yassin. And the purpose was, again, to spread ill will towards the Jewish forces so that more people would want to fight, more people would be part of the cause. Unfortunately, that rhetoric backfired on them. And they acknowledge this, by the way. Again, they've come out, the Arab media and other leaders came out saying our own rumors, our own exaggerations backfired on us. And here's where they crossed the line. They claimed in reports, and I just want to put out a quick warning that I'm going to talk about something that might trigger somebody, but they came out with reports that the soldiers were raping women. And by the way, we have no cases of this, but they claim that this was happening rampantly. And there were then reports of Arabs who said, as soon as we heard the reports about the rapes, we left. Like, we could withstand it until that point. But once we heard that they would defile our women, that's it. We packed up our families and we left. So Deir Yassin happens on April 9th, 1948. And it is one of the more challenging things to talk about when you talk about the War of Independence, because again, it wasn't Israel or Jews at their best. It just wasn't. And I think there's a broad acknowledgement of that. However, it also wasn't us necessarily at our absolute worst in how it was described by the Arabs. But what did it lead to? You know, if we jump back to December of 1947, we talked about how the first big wave of people who left were about 70 to 90,000 of the leaders of the Palestinian Arab society at the time. And after that, most people kind of stayed, and then there was slow trickling out. Comes Deir Yassin, comes these rumors, these exaggerations, and we see mass fleeing take place during the month of April of 1948. And when I say mass fleeing, I'm talking about nearly half, about 300 to 350,000 of those who become refugees are going to flee during this time or be forcibly expelled, right? Because we talked about when we were going village to village, you know, we take hold of the village and the rest of the people would be expelled into usually the West Bank or whatever the area was closest, right? And so we see this mass exodus essentially occurring. And again, when I say that the Arab leadership admitted their mistakes, it's because they saw this and they said, oh my God, we're basically helping like rid what's going to potentially become the Jewish state of this Arab population. And it was after that the Arab leadership started to demand people to stay. They said, do not flee, right? But up until that point, they were spreading this kind of propaganda. Now, there's something else I think I need to talk about that usually is not mentioned because, you know, we have a tendency, especially as Jews, I think, to be very self-reflective and look back and acknowledge where we made mistakes. And I'm not going to ever be the person to stand here and say that the Jews didn't commit atrocities during the War of Independence, and many would paint Deir Yassin as an atrocity based on how it played out. That being said, to paint us as the only one committing atrocities, or as if that was the rule rather than the exception, is where things go off the rails. And to also not acknowledge that there were atrocities being committed against the Jews by the Arab forces would also not be fair. So about 3 days, I believe it was 3 days, April 12th, 1948, another massacre takes place. Now, I said another, I shouldn't say another. I should say a massacre takes place. I dubbed it the Hadassah massacre. It doesn't really have a name, it should. But let's remember that there was a part of Jerusalem that was divided from the rest of Jerusalem, and that was Mount Scopus, right? Which is where the main hospital was, where Hadassah Hospital sat. And there was an arrangement with the Jordanian Legion, because they had already invaded, like we talked about last time in February, that every day there would be convoys that would be allowed to go from Western Jerusalem up to the hospital in Mount Scopus. On April 12th, in retaliation, a revenge attack because of what happened in Deir Yassin takes place. And a convoy of 77 doctors, nurses, and patients and medical supplies on their way up towards Mount Scopus are ambushed on the road by Arab irregulars, and all 77 are murdered. Now, I struggle a lot, again, when people describe Deir Yassin and they say, oh, you guys massacred people. And again, I will be the historian to look back and try to figure out exactly what happened there and understand it. If we have to own up to something, by all means, I'm ready to do that. But to try to paint it as we were the ones who were brutal and they were the ones who were innocent, I think is really problematic. Because those 77 people, there was no battle. They weren't a threat. They were doctors, nurses, and patients trying to get to a hospital. And to paint that any other way but a massacre would be wrong. And we can jump ahead a month later, right? May 13th, 1948. May 13th, 1948 is the day before Israel's going to declare independence. It's also the day that the 4 villages, or one of the 4 villages, Jewish villages, south of Jerusalem, in what is now known as Gush Etzion, what was then Kfar Etzion, that's the day that village will fall. And fighters remained to try to hold their ground. And eventually they were surrounded by Arab irregulars. And when they tried to surrender, they were all killed. And so again, war is war. And I'm not going to try to paint a pretty picture of it, because it's not. But I'm also not going to try to paint this horrible picture of Israel as if Israel is somehow, or was in any way, unique in how they conducted themselves during this war. This was 1948. And if you compare the way that we conducted ourselves in 1948 to the way many other militaries were conducting themselves at that time, you could actually say that we were conducting ourselves in a way more moral way. But yes, there were times where we faltered. And there were also many times when the Arab irregulars also faltered. And I think we need to just look at it in that bigger picture and understand that context of all of this. And that gets me to May 14th, 1948. May 14th, when Israel declares independence, like we spoke about last time. And we have a few things that happen. One, we get recognized. We talked about this last time, so I'm just going to put it aside. But we're short on ammunition. And an incident takes place that it's not necessarily directly related to the Palestinian conflict, but I think it is very, very, very relevant for Israel. You know, we were short on ammunition. Actually, Shimon Peres, there's a lot of really familiar names that will come up during these stories, but Shimon Peres was a young soldier at the time, and he was actually responsible for counting the bullets and counting the ammunition and seeing what we had. And he reports back that we're short and we need ammunition. And Menachem Begin, who is the head of the Irgun, right, has arranged a shipment of weapons to come to help this now new Jewish state. Let's remember, though, it's a new Jewish state. And Ben-Gurion is seen as the leader, as the de facto leader. And on May 15th, 1948, when Israel is officially born, our 4 militias are supposed to disband and join up into one army, the IDF. And so when those shipment of weapons were coming in, the expectation was they would go to the IDF. But Menachem Begin said, but wait a second, there is one unit of the Irgun, of the Etzel, that's still fighting in Jerusalem, fierce battles against the Jordanians, trying to hold on to the old city of Jerusalem. And he said some of those weapons have to go to the Etzel in Jerusalem. And Ben-Gurion said, no, we can't have this. We can't have this division. This is too dangerous. And it's hard to even know what word to use. Tragic, significant, instrumental moment takes place in our history, which was as this ship, and as I say the name, many of you will probably know the story that I'm referring to, but the Altalena approaches the banks of Tel Aviv, right? The waters of the Mediterranean, approaches the beach. And Ben Gurion, who is not having this idea that this is going to divide us, he makes a very serious decision. And he tells soldiers on that beach to fire upon the Altalena. Crazy enough, one of those soldiers was none other than Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin on the coast fires upon the Altalena along with other troops. On that ship is Menachem Begin. Here we have a story with 3 or 4 future prime ministers or presidents, prime ministers, all taking place at the same time. We fire upon the ship and something really significant happens. Menachem Begin orders the troops on board to not fire back. And he says over and over, and he will continue to repeat this for the rest of his life, that Jew should never raise arms against another Jew. And it was probably because of him that maybe a civil war or, the Jewish people in the land didn't become totally fractured during the War of Independence. And many would argue Ben Gurion made the wrong decision, but some people might say that actually that's also what kept us together, is that we needed to make sure that there was one leader. But it was a trying time during the War of Independence. But those weapons, along with, those weapons which we needed, what really will eventually come to our aid, like I spoke about last time, will be the Czechoslovakians giving Israel the weapons that we need to be able to continue this fight. We continue. There's a ceasefire in June. In July, we have more fierce battles where we're going to see more expulsions and more fleeing of refugees, which is going to get us up to the number of 715,000, which is the number of refugees that will register with the UN upon the end of this war. Now, we talked about what happened leading up, September, the assassination of the UN High Commissioner. We have in November, this effort by the UN to try to end this war. And in December, they pass a resolution in the General Assembly, UN Resolution 194. UN Resolution 194 is about how we're going to end this war. And one of the articles of that resolution is about refugees. And it says, those refugees wishing to return and live in peace shall be permitted to do so at the earliest practical date. I want you to kind of hear the words because today the UN, or I should say a body of the UN and refugees, Palestinian refugees from then until today, have taken this to mean that they have a right of return, that this grants them the right to return to Israel. Now, again, I'm going to repeat the words. Those refugees wishing to return and live in peace shall be permitted to do so at the earliest practical date. Let's remember 2 things. One, nowhere in there does it say that they have a right to return, because a right means that there's no conditions, right? If it's a right, there's no conditions. This was conditional. It was based on your willingness to live in peace, right? And at the earliest practical date, well, maybe that date's never come. And second, the General Assembly does not pass laws. Everything that they pass are advisory statements. So even if they try to say, according to international law, I have the right of return, no, you don't, because UN Resolution 194 is not international law. And so whenever people bring up the right of return, I tend to always want to start there to understand, like, there is no legal right of return. Now, if you want to talk about a moral right of return, that's another conversation and we can have it. So let's understand what happens with the refugees. So in November, when they were doing these talks, the Israelis actually said, if this war ends and all the Arab countries make peace with Israel, we'll let the people come back because we won't be threatened. What happens? The war ends and no Arab country makes peace with Israel, right? They signed ceasefire agreements with Israel, again, talked about last time, but nobody declares peace with Israel. Nobody recognizes Israel's existence after this war. So Israel's sitting there thinking, we're just a little scared to let 700,000 people back into our country. And you're saying if they're willing to live in peace, how are we supposed to know who's going to be willing to live in peace? Right? Are we supposed to give them a test? How are we supposed to determine this? And some people might look at me sometimes and say, that sounds a little paranoid. Like, what did Israel expect? And I'm like, I'm sorry, with all due respect, if there's one time period, and I would say most time periods, but if there's one time period where you cannot accuse the Jews of being paranoid, it's in 1949. Like, with all due respect, look at the last 10 years of our existence, okay? We suffered a genocide, and then literally a battle for our existence in our land. Meanwhile, while that's happening, there's mass expulsions of Jews from the Arab world, and you're trying to call me paranoid? And then it gets even better. The head of the Arab League, a guy by the name of Rahman Azam, comes forward and actually says out loud, when the refugees return, they will act as saboteurs from within. Thanks. I don't think I sound paranoid anymore. It kind of sounds like I'm right on the mark. And so Israel, this small, terrified, just traumatized country full of people who are now even more traumatized, are like, yeah, no, we're not, we can't, with all due respect, like, we're not about to play fast and loose with the existence of our country right now. Sorry, not sorry. So we say, these refugees need to stay where they ended up. Like, you got to figure it out, but they're not coming back to Israel. Not happening. So what happens? Comes December of 1949. Let me just pull up a slide here so we can get some visual aids going. But comes comes December of 1949, and the UN decides to go ahead and establish a UN body that's going to look after these Arab refugees from this war. So the organization is UNRWA. It's founded, like I said, in December of 1949. And again, throughout this process, as it's being founded, just like the Jews ended up in refugee camps like we talked about last time, the Arabs also end up in refugee camps scattered in the countries around them, like you saw on that last map: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza. The majority ending up in Jordan. So then UNRWA is established, right? Now, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, was established to look after the Arab refugees, specifically to provide welfare for the Arab refugees. Now, here's the crazy thing, and this is going to be crazy. They don't give them a mandate to solve the refugee problem. So they're given a mandate to provide welfare, which they do. And they've been giving welfare for 70 years. Meanwhile, a year later, the UN establishes another body to look after all the other refugees in the world, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. And when the UNHCR was established, they were given two mandates: provide welfare, find lasting and durable solutions to refugee problems. So what the UNHCR has been doing for 70 years is providing welfare and trying to find solutions, minimizing the number of refugees. Because UNRWA only provides welfare and doesn't look for solutions, this is the only population of refugees that has not shrunk, but has only grown throughout the last 73 years. Now, a lot of people ask, why and how did this happen? Again, UNRWA came around a year earlier. The UNHCR came around later. They thought that the solution was going to be Israel allowing these refugees to return. So they didn't give a mandate for a solution because they said, oh, the solution is going to be them returning, and we're just going to wait for that to happen, which clearly wasn't a good idea. And as a result, let's try to look at this in practice and just get a better understanding of how this plays out. So UNRWA, again, they were established, they build these refugee camps, then they start to provide, again, the initial welfare, food, medical supplies. Eventually they build schools and they provide education and they provide job training and all of those things that a government would usually help you with. Meanwhile, the UNHCR, let's use a modern day example, right? Syria breaks out into civil war. There are refugees fleeing into the surrounding countries. UNRWA would swoop into those countries like Jordan and establish refugee camps, right? That's the initial providing of welfare. And then as time goes on, they try to get people out of those refugee camps, and eventually they try to find solutions, which usually entails resettlement, right? Which in the Syrian context definitely did. They convened meetings in the UN and they said, who are willing to take in refugees? And, Canada was like, we'll take 20,000, and Germany's like, we'll take 30,000, and they start to resettle people. And once people are resettled, they have citizenship in these countries. They're no longer refugees. This has never happened with the Palestinian refugees. Now, some people will say, again, we have to add that, why is the refugee group the only one growing? You would say, but again, people are dying, obviously, like 700,000 people from then are not still alive. So why? Well, because of this circumstance, the Palestinians are the only refugee group that passes their status on to their children. Now, this is not a unique status that was like laid out by the UN in UNRWA. It just happened this way because I'll give another example. Let's say you're a Syrian woman and you are 8 months pregnant and you flee Syria and you end up in Jordan, right? And you then give birth to your child in a refugee camp. You will pass your refugee status onto your child, okay? Your child is born into a refugee camp. The UNHCR will identify your child as a refugee. However, the unique circumstance of the Palestinians is that that child will grow up in a refugee camp and give birth to their own child before they've been resettled. That's not happening with Jordanian refugees, or excuse me, Syrian refugees, or any other refugee group in the world, because by the time that child grows up to have their own children, they will already have been resettled or will have been able to return home. So as a result of the circumstances, we have the Palestinians now being the only refugee population in the world who has passed their status on not just one generation, but multiple generations, which is why today there are now not 700,000 refugees, but there are now 5.7 million Palestinian refugees. I struggle a lot when I talk about this issue because to me, it's one of the sadder realities of our conflict. I think of what it would be like to be a child growing up in a refugee camp, where it's not my parents who necessarily are giving me, what I need, but it's this external organization, UNRWA, right? And what ultimately happens after generation after generation is we've created a reality of pure dependency on an external organization. And after multiple generations, you don't know anything else. So I go to a refugee camp in Ramallah, right? I think it's called Jilabun. I go to the Jilabun refugee camp in Ramallah, and I'm speaking to a refugee who's got to be in like his 50s. And, he's telling the story of like, when I was growing up, UNRWA provided everything for us. When I needed new shoes, I got new shoes. When I needed school supplies, I got school supplies. And, UNRWA doesn't have the budget now. So, when my kid needs shoes, he doesn't have shoes. And, as a Westerner, you hear that story and you think to yourself, like, go buy your kid shoes. Like, what are you doing? Like, what do you mean? Right. And then I have to like step outside of my Western mentality. And I have to realize that this person has been raised dependent his entire life. He doesn't know any better. And neither will his kids, and neither will his grandchildren. This is a problem that will only continue to grow. And the saddest part is that there is nobody out there actually looking for a real solution to this problem. And if you go onto the UNRWA website, which by the way is literally an education in and of itself, if you go to their FAQ section of their website, right, the frequently asked questions, they will say, when asked, why don't you try to resettle? They will say, it's not in the mandate. UN Resolution 194 says that they have a right of return. And so we're waiting until they return. It's like, so you've thrown your hands up. And it's just, sometimes like, there's a lot of us and them and, we're this and they're our enemy and we see it that way. And I would encourage everyone to take a step back from that and look at these population and realize like, yes, these people may have been indoctrinated over the last 50, 60 years to hate us, but they are also very much victims of a system that was set up that would not be to their benefit. And yes, hindsight's 2020. And I don't think anyone, when they set it up, knew that this would be the reality, but here it is. And we have to deal with the reality at hand, and we're not. I'm going to leave that there. We've already looked at the time. Like I knew this was going to take, because this is one of those issues that I don't like to minimize. But if you want to learn more about this issue, Einat Wilf just wrote an amazing book in the last few years called The War of Return. It is an amazing read, and it dives into this topic in significantly more depth. So if you want to take a deep dive into the refugee problem, The War of Return by Einat Wilf is an amazing resource to do just that. We'll leave it there. So ultimately what happens, let's understand these refugees, like this ultimately has an implication on the conflict, because the refugees, ultimately this trauma that these people go through, and I'm going to call it a trauma, they call it a trauma, right? The Palestinians call the War of Independence the Nakba, right? The catastrophe, because as far as they're concerned, they lost their land. A lot of them became refugees, and they'll spend the next, 70 years, some of them still in refugee camps. This was a collective trauma. And they say that what helps create a nation is a collective experience. And sometimes that experience could be a collective trauma. And that experience really took these tribes, these Arab tribes that till this day are not necessarily all friendly with each other, but it united them. And slowly but surely, as we go through the 50s and into the 60s, we have this unification that occurs as a result. And with that, again, we start to see the rise of this national identity, the Palestinians. And the first organization that we're going to see, like I mentioned earlier, in 1959, will be Fatah. Now, Fatah was created by Palestinians without the endorsement of the Arab League, but they will be kind of the first representative body of the Palestinians. 5 years later, though, comes the PLO in 1964, this time endorsed by the Arab League, which is significant because then the Arab League has some kind of control. But that's really going to be the moment where the Palestinian identity is solidified as its own identity. Now, granted, they're still part of the broader pan-Arabist idea that's out there, but they're also still their own entity, the Palestinians. So then comes 1967. And let's understand, up until 1967, from 1964, when the PLO was established, this is when we start to see, or really see, an increase and an organized violence coming from the Palestinians. Throughout the 50s, into the 60s, we saw cross-border attacks that occurred from Gaza, from the West Bank, from organizations that were created by Egypt and Jordan. But now comes Fatah, and they're going to do it on their own. And then comes 1964, the PLO, and they're going to do it on their own. And the PLO charter says it. It says their goal is to liberate Palestine through armed struggle. So we're engaging with the Palestinians through counterterrorism. Then comes 1967. And in 1967, like we spoke about last time, Israel takes control over the territories of the West Bank and Gaza, amongst others. But I'm focusing now on the West Bank and Gaza, because when they take over the West Bank and Gaza, obviously they're not just taking over territory, but they are now going to be ruling over the lives of over 1 million Palestinians. And that is what many people will begin to refer to as occupation. Now, this is a word that is very disputed, I would say, within our community. So I just want to talk about it. Okay. Look, I'm very careful with my words when I'm not amongst friends. Okay. When I'm out on a campus, I'm not going to say occupation, 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 and repeat it over and over, because I know that when I do that, I reinforce falsities that people have in their heads about what this supposed occupation is and looks like and why it exists. That being said, what happened is Israel takes control over a territory that we can argue is a disputed territory, because the Israelis have never been sovereign, the Palestinians have never been sovereign. It's disputed between those two people. And so the territory itself, I think it's a stretch to say that it's occupied, unless you just want to paint it as a very simple, well, if a territory is taken in war, therefore it's occupied. But disputed territory. That being said, when you take over a territory that's not yours and you put your military into that territory to administer it, putting aside the very semantic definition of occupation, which is when one sovereign nation takes the territory of another sovereign nation, if you break it down, what does that ultimately look like for somebody on the ground? That looks like there is a foreign military ruling over my day-to-day life. And the Geneva Conventions are going to be the laws that are going to be used to govern my life, right? The laws of occupation laid out in the Fourth Geneva Convention. Well, that's the reality for Palestinians after 1967. And there's no other way to cut it, right? An Israeli military takes over these areas and establishes an Israeli military administration over those territories using the laws of occupation. And so I kind of am like, if it looks like a duck and it talks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so everything about what we do in these areas is an occupation until the middle of the 1990s. But up until that point, it's a full, what it would look like anywhere else would be occupation. But again, with a gray area, because this isn't sovereign territory. It's a disputed territory. What does that mean for the Palestinians? Like, just on the ground, why am I acknowledging this? I'm acknowledging it because I'm acknowledging their lived experiences. What does it mean to be a Palestinian living under Israeli occupation starting in 1967? Well, Israel has two main responsibilities, right? One is they're responsible for their own citizens, right? So protecting Israelis from terrorism and violence coming out of those areas. That's our justification for staying in those areas. But two, well, now you're the high acting authority. You're the only governing body in that area. So you have to take care of the people in that area, i.e. Palestinians. So healthcare, infrastructure, education, amenities, utilities, policing, the legal system, all of that is Israel's responsibility now. And I have to tell y'all, usually when I say this, people like roll their eyes at me because they think I'm crazy because it just sounds too good. But I have to say Israel did both really, really well. Okay, what do I mean? Well, when it comes to the latter, Israel knew how to nation build. We had just done it, right? So we did provide all of those things that we were supposed to. We developed all of the infrastructure in the West Bank and in Gaza. We built the hospitals, we built universities, we built schools, we built clinics. We watched things get better. And when I say things, let's talk about it. The quality of life that we would usually gauge. Healthcare got better. We saw infant mortality rates drop. We saw life expectancy rise. Education got better. We saw we saw higher literacy rates and more people getting higher degrees. We saw the economy get better. GDP rose during this time period because the infrastructure was more developed, making it easier to import and export. So we saw the economy get better. And so in all these ways that we would gauge quality of life, things got better. And now there's a very, very, very big but that I have to throw out there. Because there's one other way that we gauge quality of life, and that's freedom. And the Palestinians didn't have freedom. And they lived at the whim of the Israeli military and obviously international law, but how much does that actually play out on the ground? So what does that mean for a Palestinian? Okay, so I'm living in the West Bank. I understand that I have great healthcare and I have really good education and I have a really good job and it pays me well, wonderful. But every day I go into my home and I know that if I'm suspected of terrorism, at any moment, Israeli soldiers can storm into my house, pull me out of my bed in the middle of the night, take me out to a tent and interrogate me all night. And I have little to no legal recourse to fight against that kind of treatment. And if you're an innocent person, and you might be sitting there saying, okay, but they're terrorists, why should I care? Intelligence isn't always right. To think that innocent people don't get caught up in the middle of counterterrorism is just, it's naive. And so as much as I can sit here and I will argue that Israel has every reason to be in that area to protect ourselves from the ongoing terrorism that has taken place from that territory from then until today. That doesn't mean that it's not having a direct impact on the lives of innocent Palestinians. And, there's a lot of claims that are out there and things that people throw out. Apartheid-like policies, which again, I will spend next class debunking left and right. And they use a word that I also debunk, which is oppression. I struggle with that word because oppression means you're trying to keep somebody less than. You're trying to maintain them below you, a lowly position. You usually don't build schools and hospitals for people who you're trying to keep in a secondary position. And people might say, well, that sounds really colonialist. Like, who was running those schools? Not the Israelis. Okay, those schools are run by Palestinians. They get their own education. So no, it's not a control thing. It was a thing of, this is our responsibility and we're going to try to make these people's lives better. But at the same time, we have to do counterterrorism. So Palestinians have grievances. I mean, they have very illegitimate grievances, oppression, apartheid, et cetera, which are just wild exaggerations and like a misuse of terminology and a real rewriting of the reality. But real genuine grievances do emerge, I would say, post-1967. In terms of just the treatment because of the really challenging and dirty nature that is counterterrorism. And there's no other way to paint it. And the last thing to note, which is so important, is that it's not like Israel had somebody to take their cue from, right? It's not like somebody had written a book on counterterrorism that we could then go and look at. In fact, Israel's been writing the book on counterterrorism for the last 50 years, and everyone tends to turn to us and take their cue from us. And what does that mean? That means there's been a lot of trial and error. And who suffers when there's the errors? The Palestinians. And who suffers when we fail? Innocent Israelis who die from terrorism. This is not an easy scenario, but the worst thing we could do is look at somebody who lives in that kind of reality and try to deny their lived experience. It's not helpful. It's in fact harmful. It's as painful when somebody looks at me, a child of the Second Intifada, and says, what's Israel defending themselves from? What terrorism are you talking about? Because trust me, I know what terrorism I'm talking about. I lived with it every day. And so the same way that I don't want them to deny that lived experience, I'm not going to deny theirs. And again, I'm not talking about terrorists. I don't have sympathy for terrorists, but I do have sympathy for innocent people who get caught in the middle of all of this. And that is a fact of our conflict, no doubt about it. So that starts in 1967, this whole reality that I just laid out for you. And it continues obviously for the next 55 years until today, with a shift that's going to happen in the 90s. And we'll get there in a second. But let's move forward through the 60s and into the 70s. What's happening with Palestinians? So the PLO is based in Jordan. But in 1970, the PLO tries to kind of take over Jordan a little bit, topple the leadership there. And the king is having none of it. And he goes ahead and he slaughters, massacres Palestinians in Jordan, what becomes famously known as Black September. This happens in September of 1970. That forces the PLO out of Jordan, and they work their way up from Jordan through Syria into Lebanon, where they lay out their base of operation in southern Lebanon. And throughout the 1970s, we start to see terrorism coming from a different place, right? Before that, it was coming from Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and it's not anymore because now Israel's in those areas, right? Where is it now coming from? From southern Lebanon. Let me just pull up a slide so that we can kind of jump on this. So you've got now the PLO, we did this last time, you got the PLO based in southern Lebanon. And now, y'all, you guys remember it better than I do because I wasn't alive yet. A lot of you were alive, but the 1970s, people forget how bad the terrorism was. I forgot for a long time. I had to remind myself. And it wasn't just in Israel. It was everywhere. And we know this, right? We think of the 1970s and we think of Black September at the Munich Olympics. And we think of this very public terrorism that the Jews were experiencing, right? We think of all of the plane hijackings by the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, right? Let's remember that by 1968, Fatah and the PLO have come together, right? Now they're all under the PLO umbrella, and more terrorist organizations have formed under this umbrella organization that is the PLO. And they're conducting terrorism from southern Lebanon into Israel proper and around the world. Again, their primary method was plane hijackings. And let's remember that at this point, the world very much saw the Palestinians as terrorists. You know, it took me a long time to realize this, but I'm sure we've all heard of Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire," right? And he goes through the history of the 20th century in that song. And sometimes we forget that he actually mentions Palestine. But what does he rhyme Palestine with? Palestine, terror on the airline. And could you imagine if somebody put that into a song today? Oh my God, they would be canceled so fast. But back then, what were people supposed to say? He's right. They're hijacking airplanes. They're taking innocent people hostage all over the world. So throughout the 70s, we suffer horrendous terrorism. And in Israel proper, we're also dealing with horrible attacks like the Maalot massacre right here on the map, where students were having a sleepover inside of a school and PLO terrorists infiltrated from Lebanon, took them hostage in a school, over 100 of them, and ended up murdering 26 children and teachers during an attempt to rescue them. And if you haven't heard about this, go and Google it, the Maalot massacre. Or in 1978, when the most famous female terrorist, Dalal Mughrabi, takes her and a few other terrorists take a bus, hijack a bus in northern Israel, right here in Nahariya, what becomes known as the Coastal Road Massacre. They hijack this bus and they end up killing all 38 people inside, including 11 children. It was the deadliest terrorist attack we've ever had in Israel. Happened in 1978. And so by this time, Israel's sitting there going, we need to deal with this terrorism. And it's coming from Lebanon. And so in 1982, Israel launches an operation known as Operation Freedom for the Galilee. And we go into southern Lebanon to try to get rid of the PLO. And we're successful. 1982, within 6 months, the PLO is kicked out of southern Lebanon. They end up in Tunisia. And that's where they function until they are invited back to the West Bank in the 1990s. Meanwhile, down in the West Bank and Gaza, things are getting worse. Why? Because Palestinians have now been living 20 years under occupation. And they're frustrated. You know, terrorists are recruiting inside of universities. And so we're sending forces into universities to break up terror cells. But if you're an innocent student trying to study at a university, it feels like this person who you have been preached to as an ideology, you've been told, this is your enemy, this is your oppressor, they stole our land, they're continuing to steal our land, and now they're coming into your university. And the tension just grows and grows until the point, and by the way, there's the war still going on in Lebanon. I mean, we're still in southern Lebanon and there are refugees in these camps in southern Lebanon dealing with this. And so it reaches a head in 1987 when the first Intifada breaks out. Now, the first Intifada started out as, one could argue, very legitimate protests. And they were just that, protests. But those protests will slowly devolve into outright riots as we know them today, right? Rock throwing, Molotov cocktails, shooting, etc. But then comes the terrorist organizations that also take advantage of this and start to commit terrorist attacks. Now, these are not as deadly. They're fought with guns, with pistols, because Israel has been present in that area for 20 years. They've cracked down. They don't have access to automatic weapons or any, and they don't have the ability to make very advanced bombs to try to kill a lot of people. So it was small attacks that were happening. And we should also talk about the Palestinian intifada that was happening at the same time, where Palestinians were killing other Palestinians who were being accused of collaborating with Israel, which actually was a significant amount of the Palestinians who died during the intifada actually died at the hands of other Palestinians. But this intifada, 87, 88, 89, it really sent a message to Israel. Like, yo, there are people who are under your control and they're really not happy and you got to deal with them. And again, let's go back to why I separated out these two classes, the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian, because Israel also needed to start to separate these two conflicts in their head at this point and realize that you could make peace with Jordan and Egypt and other countries, but that's not going to solve the problem with the Palestinians. Let's also understand one other aspect of what happens at this time period. There's a religiousization that happens with this conflict. If we go back to the root causes from the first class that I taught, we talked about land, we talked about nationalism, we talked about Arab rejectionism. I very, very rarely spoke about religion because it wasn't a driving force for this conflict. It becomes much more of a driving force for both the Palestinians and the Jews after 1967 and for the Arabs after the 1980s. So we see the formation of Palestinian Islamic terrorist organizations in the 1980s. 1982, Islamic Jihad emerges in Gaza. 1987, Hamas emerges in Gaza. And now we start to see a religious drive to eradicate Israel. And on the Israeli side, we see more of a messianic drive to preserve the territory of the West Bank, specifically as part of Israel, which is going to make this conflict, again, get worse and worse. So then comes 1988, and Yasser Arafat does the most brilliant thing. Again, up until this point, the Palestinians were terrorists. That's how people saw them, because they were Palestinian, not all Palestinians, obviously. The Palestinian terrorists were terrorists, though they weren't anything else that. Today, you say that, and people are like, they're not terrorists, and we'll talk about it. So what does Yasser Arafat do? The head of the PLO, right? He goes to the UN in 1988, and he declares independence. But where does he declare independence? In the West Bank and Gaza. Wait a second. I'm sorry. The PLO charter says that your goal is to liberate Palestine, which didn't include the West Bank and Gaza because those were under Arab control in 1964. You were talking about Israel. So now all of a sudden, wait, you're not trying to destroy Israel anymore? Now you just want independence in the West Bank and Gaza? Now, that didn't even go to a vote. Okay, it wasn't recognized by the UN, but what a brilliant rhetorical tactic. He changes the language. We don't want to destroy Israel. We just want freedom from occupation. Hashtag free Palestine. And now Palestinians aren't terrorists anymore. They're freedom fighters fighting against an illegal, illegitimate occupation. And all of a sudden comes the 1990s and we start to see a real shift in the way that the world views the Palestinians. And they start to turn more and more against Israel. Come on, Israel, just end your occupation. And all of the terrorism from before has been forgotten or has now been chalked up to a reaction to occupation. I want to stress something. It was a rhetorical shift. It was not an ideological shift. Yasser Arafat in Arabic continued to preach the same thing, which was what he called his phased plan. The phased plan was, we'll get a little bit from Israel. We'll just, like right now, we'll just talk about the West Bank and Gaza. And like, we'll get that. And then like, we'll calm down for a little bit and then we'll fight some more, right? Until we end up getting back all of the land of historic Palestine. So a rhetorical shift, but not an ideological one. He continued to preach to his people the chant that we always hear today, the Hamas chant of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So comes the 1990s. And at this point, the Israelis are kind of like, maybe we need to negotiate with the Palestinians. And specifically, it's not the government, it's random Israelis who are like, let's try to get like some random Palestinians who like are like academics or journalists, people who might have an influence to like come together and talk, and maybe we can like break down some barriers. And they do. And this happens secretly in a city called Oslo. And eventually, when these people return home and they say, yo, we've made progress to their governments say, you know what? Okay, let's try. Rabin secretly sends a delegation, as does the PLO, and they come to an agreement. And the agreement is known as the Declaration of Principles. The Declaration of Principles will, of course, be the famous agreement that will be signed on the White House lawn by Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, with Bill Clinton standing in between them in September of 1993, when so many people thought, oh my God, there's going to be peace in the Middle East. Look, the Israelis and the Palestinians are signing this declaration. The Declaration of Principles essentially said that the Palestinians would recognize Israel, and that the Israelis would recognize the PLO as this representative body of the Palestinians, and that they would work together to create Palestinian self-government. And that was the terminology, by the way. They didn't talk about statehood, they talked about Palestinian self-government. So they signed this agreement, and then they agree in that agreement that they're going to continue to negotiate over the next 5 years, what's known as the interim period, right? And at the end of those 5 years, we're going to sign a final agreement, and we will have solved all the final status issues, right? Final status issues being Jerusalem, refugees, borders, settlements, security, etc. So we start to negotiate, and Oslo is going to change everything. The Oslo Accords change the scene. So what happens? First of all, a Palestinian government is established. Let's remember, the PLO is a representative body internationally. They're not a government. Now, the Palestinian Authority is established on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza to govern the lives of the Palestinians living in those areas. And that allows Israel to withdraw from territory. So Israel will slowly begin to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. Now, they withdraw from the major city centers of these areas, right? So think of Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jericho, Jenin, Tulkarem, Shechem, Kalkilia. These are the cities that Israel will pull out of, and obviously in Gaza, Gaza City. So we pull out of these areas and we hand them over to the Palestinian Authority to govern completely autonomously, okay? Those areas will become known as Area A, the major cities of the West Bank and Gaza, under full PA control, meaning Israel now hands over to the PA, responsibilities over healthcare, infrastructure, education, amenities, utilities, policing, the legal system. All of it is now their responsibility. So I always have to point out to people that while I talk about occupation up until the middle of the 1990s, from then on, I have to talk about what I call quasi-occupation, because the world has to understand that there's no longer just one authority in the West Bank. There are now two authorities in the West Bank, and they function side by side with each other. And most importantly, this was not forced upon the Palestinians. This was agreed upon by the Palestinians and the Israelis. They shook hands on it and they agreed upon this. This wasn't forced upon them. Now, just to understand the rest of the breakdown of the West Bank, the smaller towns and villages of the Palestinians in the West Bank will fall under what's known as Area B, where the civil control will be Palestinian Authority, meaning, again, healthcare, infrastructure, education, amenities, etc. But the security will still be under the control of the Israelis. So there's still Israeli military present in those areas. And then lastly is Area C, which remains a majority of the West Bank. It's all of the uninhabited lands, the major roadways, and the settlements. And that will stay under full Israeli military control, with a civil administration that deals with the civil affairs within that area. That's Area C. So Israel does these withdrawals. And these are like signs of hope for a lot of people. They're thinking, okay, like no longer are these people living under our control. Now they're living under their own government's control that they voted for in a free and fair election where Yasser Arafat wins as president of the PA and his political party, Fatah, wins as the majority of the parliament. And then everything starts to fall apart. Terrorists hear about this and they're like, no. And even Yasser Arafat himself, he says in English, peace, peace, peace. And then in Arabic, he says jihad, 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 because he continues to preach the phased plan. And so not just from Hamas, who's his rival, and Islamic Jihad, but from the PFLP, from organizations that have been affiliated with the PLO, we start to see terrorism increase. We start to see suicide bombings for the first time. And in the months, in the years of the Oslo Accords, we see more Israelis being killed from terrorism than in the 15 years prior. And Israelis start to become disillusioned. Why are we doing this? We're making peace with terrorists who are still killing us. And the right wing in Israel uses this rhetoric against the left-wing Yitzhak Rabin government and says, we need to get rid of this government. They're only causing us more harm. And the saddest part is that somebody takes that to an extreme. And in 1995, Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by a fellow Israeli Jew. I would argue one of the most tragic moments in Israeli history. But the peace talks continue. Shimon Peres takes over in his stead, hangs on until there's an election when Bibi Netanyahu, yes, that Bibi Netanyahu, gets elected for the first time in the 1990s and is the prime minister from 96 until the year 2000. And we continue to attempt peace and we continue to negotiate the Oslo Accords. But by 97, 98, it's all fallen apart and the things get quiet again. But there's a lasting impact of Oslo, because not only are Israelis disillusioned, Palestinians are also disillusioned. Why? Because their lives slowly start to get worse. Why? Because Israel's not taking care of them anymore. And the assumption was that their own government would take care of them. But the PA unfortunately becomes corrupt pretty much from the get-go. They take money from, the Americans, from the Europeans, and they do not give it to the people. It doesn't trickle down. They make themselves very, very wealthy. Yasser Arafat becomes a very, very wealthy man, and his wife is literally still spending your tax dollars in Malta, where she lives in a mansion. And this has continued. The PA leaders built for themselves villas in Ramallah and Gaza, and the Palestinians are watching going, how am I benefiting from this? And they get angry, and they turn into the open arms of who? Well, the rival of Fatah, which is Hamas. And Hamas says to them, we're going to give you healthcare, and we're going to build schools, and we're going to build hospitals, and they do. And we're going to give you jobs. And they win over people. And then they radicalize people. Now, radicalization became a lot easier during Oslo, because now the Palestinians have their own areas, and they have their own schools, and they have their own, there's no monitoring from Israel. And so we start to see incitement against Israel increase dramatically. And again, it's easy because post-Oslo, Israelis and Palestinians don't know each other anymore. We live in a reality where before Oslo, there were no borders. There were no checkpoints. We could travel freely. I lived in a neighborhood in Jerusalem called Gilo, which was right over the hill from Bethlehem. And people in Gilo every Saturday would go into Bethlehem and they'd have hummus and they'd do their shopping. Not anymore. And so from Oslo onwards, a generation emerges in this world of Israelis and Palestinians who no longer know each other. And when you don't know somebody and somebody comes and says that you should hate them and all you see of them is one thing, you're going to hate them. So Israelis today can grow up their entire adolescent lives never meeting a Palestinian. And maybe the only Palestinian they're ever going to meet or encounter is going to be a terrorist. And that's their perception of the other side. And Palestinians can grow up their entire adolescent lives having never met an Israeli, except for one kind, a soldier. Somebody that they are raised and told is their enemy and is there to oppress them. And here we are 25 years later, and we still live in the status quo of Oslo. Nothing has changed. Since 1997, the Israelis and the Palestinians have yet to sign another agreement changing the reality on the ground. So we live in a status quo of something that was drawn up over 25 years ago, where the facts on the ground have changed dramatically. So here we are. Oslo falls apart, and we're left with people clinging to hope. And a leader steps up and he heeds that call for hope. His name is Ehud Barak. And he gets elected in the year 2000, 1999, 2000. And he takes office and he ran on a platform of, I'm going to end this. I'm going to end this. I'm going to do everything in my power to make peace. And he puts a deal on the table for Yasser Arafat. Now, before we get into this deal, let's understand exactly what the Palestinians want. Okay. They want three core things. One, they want land. Okay. They want an end to the occupation. So they want land. They claim the West Bank and Gaza rhetorically, but ideologically speaking, they would still say all of the land from the river to the sea. They want refugees to be able to return to Israel, right? We talked about the right of return, which is hugely problematic because now there's 5.7 million of them, and that would seriously mess up the demographics of the Jewish state. And lastly, they want Jerusalem as their capital. So what's offered to them by Ehud Barak in the year 2000? Here we go. 100% of the Gaza Strip, 97% of the West Bank with land swaps, meaning a full withdrawal of all Israeli soldiers and settlers from the area that's going to become a Palestinian state, deeming that Palestinian state Judenrein, which is one of their demands, right? Free of Jews. He says, I can't have 5.7 million people return to Israel. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you $30 billion and you can resettle those refugees in your newly established state that I'm now going to give you in the West Bank and Gaza. And I'll even build a tunnel or a bridge to connect the two territories so your country will be contiguous. And the last thing he offers is a shared capital in Jerusalem. We'll split Jerusalem. You guys can have the eastern part, we'll have the western part, and we'll even divide the old city. And Yasser Arafat walked away from the table. And he went back to Ramallah. And in the next few months, he began to increase the incitement dramatically against Israel, and he waited for a trigger. And the trigger came in September of the year 2000 when our prime minister hopeful, Ariel Sharon, who was now running against Ehud Barak in the next election, decided to go and take a walk on the Temple Mount. Completely legal, but he is also the most hated leader amongst Palestinians. And so a riot breaks out. That riot bleeds into the streets, and Yasser Arafat uses it and says, see, the Israelis are coming. They're trying to take Al-Aqsa. They're trying to take Jerusalem from us. And an uprising begins. What I would call the worst time period in modern Israeli history, the Second Intifada. Now, I was a child of this time period, and I could talk about the Second Intifada in numbers. They're all up on the screen, right? An average of 12 attacks per day, 150 almost suicide bombings that take the lives of over 1,000 Israelis. The numbers don't do it justice. I'm going to take these images off the screen now. Not yet. The numbers don't do it justice. What does it justice is explaining the psychology of all of this. And I can explain it very personally because I was, again, a 13, 14-year-old kid during these years. And for me, the first thing that manifested more than anything else was exactly what terrorism is supposed to cause, which is terror. I was afraid. And I know everyone around me was afraid. I lived every day waking up, leaving my house, making sure that I told my parents that I loved them, and me hearing them say that too, just in case that would be the last thing that they would ever say to me or I would ever say to them. And I got on a bus every day to go to school, knowing that my bus could blow up. And one day it did. And that's the bus that you're looking at right now on your screen. The 32 bus out of Gilo. That was the bus that I took every day. My entire family thought that I was dead on June 18th, 2002, when that bus was blown up by a Palestinian suicide bomber who came out of the city of Bethlehem. So for Israelis, this time period manifests with fear. Every day, am I going to survive? And then comes the second thing that Israelis do. We might be scared, but we're scared and we're prepared. And so we spent our days figuring out how to protect ourselves. And that meant when I sat on that bus every morning to be aware of my surroundings. So I'd sit on the bus and I wouldn't do what I normally would do, which was read or play Snake on those ghetto fabulous Nokia phones that probably a lot of you in this room remember. But I had to sit there and I had to pay attention. So for 45 minutes every morning, I sat on the bus and I watched. Just in case a guy got on my bus and was wearing a big puffy coat, but it was the summer. And that's weird. And that would be my cue that maybe he's about to blow himself up. Or has a backpack and walks to the middle of the bus and puts the bag down and then goes and sits down. And a couple stops later, he gets off the bus, but the bag is still there. I need to notice because he might have just left a bomb on my bus. And here I was, a 13-year-old kid with that responsibility. So we were hypervigilant. We spent our days looking over our shoulder. We spent our days looking around us and avoiding crowds. And until this day, I walk up to crowds sometimes. I walk into Machane Yehuda Market, which was bombed 15 times by suicide bombers during these years. And when I walk in on a Friday afternoon and I see a crowd of people, I imagine it blowing up in front of me because that is the trauma that I was left with from this time period. Avoid these crowds, avoid these places. And people did. By the time you get to 2002, the summer of 2002, Jerusalem was a ghost town. And then came the worst part of the Intifada. People were dying at a higher rate than we'd ever seen before. And in some of the most horrific ways. I mean, suicide bombings, they're awful. They tear people apart. They're impersonal, though. I mean, then you hear the personal attacks, right? May 8th, 2001, when Kobe Mendel and Yosef Ishran decide to go hiking, two 13-year-old boys decide to go hiking near the caves where they lived in Tekoa. And 5 Arabs spot them and they back them into a cave and they beat them to death with rocks. Kobe and Yosef were my friends' friends. One of my friends survived that day because while they said, come ditch school with us, he said, I need to go to school. And he went to school and he's dealt with survivor guilt for the rest of his life until today as a result. Because 2 of his friends were beaten to death to the point that their bodies were unidentifiable by their parents. You have the story of Shalhevet Pass, a 10-month-old who's being pushed in a stroller by her parents in Hebron. And a sniper on the hillside nearby looks at this family, right? Adult male, adult female, 10-month-old in a stroller. And he looks through his sniper scope and he decides that his first target is going to be Shalhevet, the 10-month-old's head. And he blows her head off. He then proceeds to shoot her father in the leg twice. And I know that maybe some of you are sitting there going, why is she being so graphic? And I'm being so graphic for 2 reasons. One, because welcome to the lives of Israelis. I lived through this and I know these stories and they're personal because Shalhevet was also related to friends of mine. And that we know that we heard the graphic nature and we lived with it every day. And I'm also telling you it because I am so sick and tired of people comparing Palestinian terrorism to Israeli counterterrorism. I'm sick and tired of what happened last week when Israeli soldiers went into Jenin and stopped an imminent attack by terrorists by killing 9 people, the vast majority of them being terrorists. And then the next night, a terrorist walking to a synagogue and shooting 7 people dead outside, and people saying that somehow that is the same. So yes, I get graphic because the only way that people are going to understand is if you get graphic, is if you go to the depths. And how dare anyone try to compare a sniper shooting a 10-month-old in the head or 5 Arabs beating 2 13-year-olds to death with rocks with soldiers who are out there trying to protect people from that exact harm. And people have to know that Israelis were traumatized by these stories. And so when today we sit and we say, yeah, counterterrorism, do what you got to do. And why maybe today, and I'm not trying to justify it, but why maybe today the younger generation is voting for the most far-right religious and some would argue an extreme government might simply be because they're sick and tired of this reality. And again, it's not a justification because as a child of the Intifada, I learned that extreme responses to extremism is not helpful either. But we have to understand what happened to Israelis during this time period. So we walked out of the Intifada. A lot of people threw their hands up. How are we ever going to make peace with these people? These people who are capable of murdering our babies. How are we ever, is this really about land? Because we just offered the most land we've ever offered. And what came after was the worst wave of terrorism we've ever seen. That's how we lived the Intifada. Now let's go back to the Palestinians. Because I've said up until now, there's innocent Palestinians and there's Palestinian terrorists. And the innocent people lived through this too. And like I said, we were facing extremism and our response was extreme. We cracked down so hard on the lives of Palestinians during the Second Intifada. Now, for them, it manifested in 2 ways. One, you had people who were active, people who were out in the streets every single day rioting against Israeli soldiers. Now, again, you're rioting, and these riots, I mean, they would be, people throwing rocks in the front row, in the front line, but then behind them, you'd have guys throwing Molotov cocktails. That's lethal. You have guys eventually shooting live ammunition at soldiers. What do? And I want you to look at this picture, and I want you to look at this boy right here in the corner. He has a rock in his hand. He can't be more than 12 years old. And I want you to imagine being a soldier looking at this image, looking at this in front of you. And all of a sudden you start to take live fire from somebody in that crowd. And eventually you have to shoot back and you see the person shooting at you and you aim and you target and you get the approval to shoot that person who is shooting at you. And then that kid with that rock in his hands jumps right in the middle, right as you fire the shot. And he's killed. Now, I want you to look on the side. Yeah, 1,500 terrorists were killed during this time period, but 1,000 civilians were killed. I know some people might say to me, but that kid's not an innocent civilian. He's in a riot and he has a rock in his hand. And I hear you, but I also don't, because he's a 12-year-old kid and he shouldn't be there. And when his mother buries him, unless she's one of those mothers who sent him out there to become a martyr, she's going to feel the same pain burying her child. And what I think we have to remember is, regardless of all of these scenarios, people caught in the middle, they feel the same pain. And so while Israelis were living through pain and suffering during these years, the Palestinians were also experiencing grief. And they remember it just like we do. And then there were those who weren't violent, like this little kid trying to go through a checkpoint, holding a toy in his hand. And what Israel needed to do during these years is they needed to clamp down again so hard on Palestinian society because terrorists were everywhere. So they put up barriers everywhere they could. We put up checkpoints, which meant that every Palestinian, if you wanted to leave your city, you wanted to go to university, you wanted to go farm your field, you wanted to go to work anywhere else in the West Bank or in Gaza, you'd go through an Israeli checkpoint. And maybe you get to the front of the line of that checkpoint and there'd be a soldier who maybe treats you really, really well. Let's remember that you've probably waited now in a really long line because we're checking everybody. We're checking children, we're checking the elderly, we're checking the mentally disabled, we're checking ambulances. Why? Because terrorists used every single one of these people in their acts of terror. They planted a bomb in an ambulance, a suicide bomb that got into Israel and murdered 15 people. From then on, every single ambulance had to be checked. That could cost the life of the person in the back of that ambulance. We had to do it. And imagine you're a Palestinian and you're watching it happen and you're thinking, who stops an ambulance? These people are evil. You get to the front of the line of that checkpoint, you might encounter a really nice, sweet Israeli soldier who treats you with dignity and respect. You might also encounter an Israeli soldier who treats you horribly, who demonizes you and dehumanizes you and who harasses you and humiliates you. And with all due respect, I would love to say that all of our soldiers are perfect and are above board, but they're not. They're just not. And some of them can be violent and some of them can be abusive and some of them absolutely violate our code of conduct. And sometimes their commanders might turn a blind eye. And I have never spoken to a Palestinian who has not been able to tell me at least one story about going through a checkpoint and being humiliated by an Israeli soldier. And let's understand what we talked about last time, the concept of honor and shame. You shame these people, and it is in their culture to do anything in their power to restore that honor. And that includes becoming terrorists in their society. So you have checkpoints. At night, you have curfews, right? And eventually, nothing's working. Israel suffers the most horrific terrorist attack on March 27th, 2002. This is a year and a half into all of these measures. And Israel decides enough is enough. And they launch an Operation Defensive Shield, and they send forces back into all the major cities of the West Bank, which we had left, remember, during Oslo. But that's where all the terrorism was coming from. Jenin and Ramallah and Bethlehem and Tulkarem. And so we went back in. But what does that look like for a Palestinian? Tanks are rolling through your city. There are soldiers now on your corner. Imagine you're a kid. You feel like you're being invaded by this force, this oppressive force. We start to gather more intelligence, and then we take the fight directly to the terrorists, and we do house arrests, where now we know where a terrorist is going to be sleeping at night. We're not waiting for you to come to us at a checkpoint. We're going to go to you, and we're going to arrest you in the middle of the night. And y'all, we've been doing that from that point until today. Some say Operation Defensive Shield never ended because it continues until today with those efforts. And then lastly, 2 months later, in June of 2002, I missed that suicide bombing, like I said, by 10 minutes. And that day, our prime minister decided to build the security barrier around the West Bank. It cuts into the West Bank in a lot of areas because it was built for security. But eventually, with all of these measures put in place, we end up reducing terrorism by over 90%. And we now continue to try to make peace. Now, I know I only have a few minutes left, and that's why I warned you that I probably wasn't going to be able to take questions today, especially considering that I was told to slow down how quickly I speak. But I promise any questions that I don't get to, we'll copy the chat and we will get to them next class. I will start with them. But let me just wrap this up. And if I don't finish, we'll finish next class with the end of this. And I apologize. It's just, again, like you hear, it's too important to skip any of this information. So the Intifada slowly dies down. And Israel says, let's keep trying to make peace because that's what we do. And we continue to try to make peace. Throughout the aughts, you have the efforts that are made by first Bush with Mahmoud Abbas, the new president of the Palestinian Authority, after Yasser Arafat dies in November of 2004. He gets elected in January of 2005. He has now entered into his 18th year of his 4-year term as president of the Palestinian Authority. Meanwhile, we also have elections for parliament in January of 2006. And unfortunately, Hamas wins in these elections, not because they were terrorists, partially because they were terrorists, but for everyone else, they won because they were not the corrupt Fatah. People voted for change. They voted for the people who were building schools and building hospitals. And Hamas gets elected. But Fatah doesn't want to give them power, and neither does the world. And so in June of 2007, Hamas violently takes over the Gaza Strip from Fatah. They throw Fatah members off the roofs of buildings, all right? And Fatah flees the Gaza Strip out to the West Bank. And Mahmoud Abbas is now terrified because he's sitting there thinking, Hamas just took over the Gaza Strip. What's going to stop them from taking over the West Bank? And it's not a what, but it's a who. And he realizes that now he has a shared interest with Israel. And starting in 2008, Israel ends up working together with the Palestinian security forces to stop Hamas from taking over in Gaza, in the West Bank. And that prompts the last and final peace offer to be put on the table. A peace offer by Ehud Olmert in 2008 to Mahmoud Abbas. This peace offer is not hard to remember. You ready? He offered him 100% of Gaza, 100% of the West Bank with land swaps. He offered to uproot all settlements. He offered that $30 billion fund to resettle refugees. And he even said that some refugees would be allowed to return to Israel for family reunification purposes. And lastly, he yet again offered them a shared capital in Jerusalem. Mahmoud Abbas said, I'll call you back. He never did. This was the last offer put on the table for the Palestinians, and it was rejected. And to be honest with you, this is the moment where things start to turn. Because a lot of Israelis look at this and say, you know what? I'm not sure what else we can offer more than 100% and 100%. And this is when we start to see more disillusionment of Israelis saying, this isn't about land. It is about land, but it's not about the land of the West Bank and Gaza. It's about all the land. And a lot of Israelis start to turn to the right as a result of this and say, we could give up as much land as we want, but this conflict's not going to end. And this is why the vast majority of Israelis today, if you said, are you willing to give up land? They say maybe in the future, but not now. Not based on what we've seen. But we'll keep trying. The last 10 years, there's been efforts for peace. None of them reached anything close to an agreement. And it's simply because the Palestinians have never been prepared for a peaceful negotiation to this conflict and an end to this conflict of a two-state solution, of us somehow sharing this land. And more Israelis stopped feeling like the Palestinians were partners in that effort to try to end this conflict once and for all. So we sit in a stalemate. And I hate to say it, but we're nowhere when it comes to this conflict. The silver lining is the Abraham Accords and what we've done with the Arab world. But when it comes to the Palestinians, if anything, we are pushing further away from a peaceful resolution. And we are seeing extremism grow, not just on the Palestinian side, but also on the Israeli side. And, you know, for the longest time, we talked about Arab rejectionism as a core root cause of this conflict. I think I now need to add to the table Israeli rejectionism as well. Because more and more there is a growing population in Israel who also reject the idea of a solution to this conflict in the formula that has been presented in the past. And people say it's going to be something else. And I don't know what it's going to be. And I'm not here to preach the two-state solution. That was just the formula that we've always used. But I'm here to tell you that we've tried and we've tried and we've tried. But I'll tell you one thing and I'll end with this. And I'm so sorry, Joanne. I know I'm very over time. I'll end with this. And again, everything can be picked up next week. Today, there are about 7 million Israelis, 7 million Jews, and 7 million Palestinians who live, Arabs who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The vast majority feel deeply connected to that land. The vast majority believe that that land is their homeland. And the vast majority have no intention of going anywhere else. And on that foundation, we have to figure out a way to solve this conflict. And we've tried many times. And we need a partner to try as well. And I wait for that partner to rise so that we can finally one day reach a conclusion. And next week, we can talk about what that might look like. Thank you all so much for your time. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for another amazing class. We so appreciate the way you cover these complex issues in such a clear, informative, interesting, and balanced way. Thanks to all of you for caring enough about this topic to come together and learn with Beth Amjayak, Contra Costa JCC, Kolemet, Beth David, and the Sonoma County Israel Committee. If you've been enjoying this class and would like to support future programs like these, please consider an optional donation, which can be given online. The link is being entered into the chat now, so you can click on it and go to a donation page where you can make a donation. Betham, Jayak, and Contra Costa JCC appreciate your generosity. We're looking forward to seeing you next Sunday morning, February 12th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, when Charlotte will be teaching live again. You can use the same link for that class. And please watch your inbox in the next few days for an email from Under One Tent, which will include the link to a recording of today's class and all previous classes for those of you who want to review. Thanks to you all. Enjoy your day. We'll see you next week for the final class.